Hi, everyone. This is Bob Bazanko. I'm a history professor at the University of Houston, also co-host of the Green and Red podcast. And today we have kind of an ad lib show, something we've just put together in the spur of the moment. And I'll be talking with somebody who I've known for quite some time and who I really value, and that's Fadi Kafeety. Fadi is a graduate student working on his Ph.D. in modern Arab history at the University of Houston. He's currently also an ACOR, CAORC pre-doctoral fellow. In addition to that, Fadi has a master's degree from the CUNY Graduate Center and a BA from NYU. And he understands so much of what I've learned about the Middle East and Palestine in particular has come from Fadi Kafeety. Welcome to this. Thank you for doing it at the last moment. Um, Fadi, you know a significant amount. You've been studying this for years. And we're doing this on October 7th, which is the 1 year anniversary of the kind of hostilities, the atrocities, the genocide beginning in Palestine and Gaza in particular. So just to begin, you know, the horrors that we've witnessed over the course of a year, every day seem to kind of shock us a little bit more. Even for Israel, it's kind of shocking to see this being done so openly and, doubling down on it, kind of bragging about it. So, kind of where do you think we are now compared to like what you would have anticipated or what has happened historically in the region?
No, thank you so much, Bob. First of all, I wanted to thank you for the kind words. It's an honor to be on the show. A longtime listener, and as you said, a dear friend and someone who I consider a great mentor of mine over the past years. So it's truly an honor to be speaking with you today. I wish we were speaking under better circumstances or
Yeah.
discussing better topics, but I think here we are today, 1 year since Operation Al-Aqsa Flood started on October 7, 2023. And frankly, I think nobody would have imagined ourselves being the situation unfolding in the way that it has over the past year. The genocidal situation that has been unfolding in Gaza for the past year is unprecedented in its scale and in its capacity. This is the most vicious and most violent response that the secular state of Israel has taken against Palestinians, even in comparison to 1948. For instance, when in 1948, during the Nakba period, around upwards of 750, actually closer to 900,000 Palestinians and native inhabitants were violently expelled from their lands. Of course, they went to Lebanon, to Jordan, but a large majority, and this is important for our purpose of discussion, fled from the southern and the western portions of Palestine under greater historic Gaza into a tiny enclave which became Gaza itself, the Gaza proper that we know of it today. So the people that have been suffering the most from this are generational refugees, internally displaced from neighboring settlements, from towns, from villages, from great economic centers like Jaffa, which is only a stone's throw away from where Gaza is today. The past year has been a very mixed one. Of course, it's been one ridden with horrors, destruction, unfathomable losses. The numbers that we see online, the reports that we read, especially from the Gaza Health Ministry, while they try to keep them as updated as possible, in no way reflect the actual true cost of loss of life. I mean, you can imagine a decimated infrastructure and healthcare institutional system and ministries unable to keep track of these records. We've surpassed the 42,000 mark, but as you've seen in others from reports that have come out from esteemed journals like the Lancet and other medical associations in the US, that these numbers are really upwards of 186,000, some even reaching towards 200,000, which means, Bob, this is nearly the destruction of 10%, the extermination of 10% of a community, which is a Holocaust project in and of itself. This is an extermination project through and through. But the context of this actually took the settler project by complete storm. As you've been aware, and listeners of this show will know, that the inhabitants of Gaza and the Gaza Strip has been under various forms of vicious war and siege from the state of Israel ever since they announced the withdrawal policy in 2005. There have been wars in 2005, 2006, 2008, 2009, 2011, 2012, 2014, 2021, in addition to the ongoing, what Benjamin Netanyahu calls mowing the lawn policy, which is striking every now and then. So this is a population that, of which 50% might I add, of the 2.3 million, so 1.15 million at the very least are under the age of 18. That means these are people who have known nothing but besiegement, destruction, loss, despair, displacement, calorie reductions, forced starvations, blockade from the world. This was a people that had been steadfast ever since their violent expropriation in 1948, and then found themselves 75, 76 years later in a situation where the Palestinian question was put on the back burner in regional and global politics, where the Arab regimes were undertaking a rapid policy of normalization, of which I'm happy to discuss, and one which was actually part of the forerunning events to fund Al-Aqsa flood operation. So, and one that has just known unheard of forms of suffering. Cancer rates are at historic levels. Malnutrition rates are insane. Under unemployment and homelessness, and internally placed refugees prior to October 7th was at a phenomenal rate. I mean, the whole enclave of Gaza, which, for Houstonian listeners can understand, is like the width of the two loops of Houston, the greater second loop of Houston. So if you have 2.3 million people living just in the width of it, and not even the length of the full inner loop by its greatest, and in it had 8 refugee camps within a besieged population, you can understand that the historic, political, economic, social context that brought about the Aqsa flood operation really were not out of a vacuum. Of course, the media apparatus in this world loves to discuss how this all began on October 7th and how these are Iran-backed terrorist organizations just wanting to wreak havoc and destroy the Jews. But this is actually complete fallacy, and this is a historical erasure of the context of which we led there. So to go back to the point that you made, is that when 365 days ago to this day, when Operation Al-Aqsa Flood was launched, it was really a form of a prison break, if you will. It was of a people who had been besieged under the longest siege in modern political history for 18 years now, breaking free. They broke free under an attack that was meant to resurface the Palestine question and bring it to the forefront, to exact damages on a settler colony that prides itself on having an invincible army and being undefeatable, unshakable. So when the operation took place, it took the colonialists by complete surprise and complete storm. And the people who were breaking out, the people who took out these operations, they were returning to their villages, Bob. If you look at the enclave of Gaza itself, in the immediate surrounding, dozens, around 25, 26 villages and towns were depopulated to build the settlements that exist today on ethnically cleansed land. So these were people who were returning to their homes, who were refusing the conditions which forced them under a regime of destruction and despair all their lives. They had broken in and they had attacked the settler population, not to exterminate them, not to drive them out, but to make a statement that they are still there, that the resistance is still ongoing, and that they, and this is a crucial point we can probably discuss later, that they control the times of their attacks and the space of their attacks. So in response to this, 255 captives were taken from settlers, many of which were killed over the past year by Israeli bombardments, carpet bombings, and destructions. Many of them have been killed by their own armies. We know from many reports that three captives were shot dead by their own soldiers as they were trying to escape. Several were killed actually trying to get back into Gaza. There's a very important policy that Israel pursues, which is the Hannibal Directive, which is that it would rather kill its own citizens and negotiate for their release because this is seen as a sign of weakness for them. So, of course, we can get into the details of the operation itself later, but the scale of the destruction and the onslaught that ensued over the past year was something that I don't think any of us would have predicted. Now, of course, I can't speak for the resistance forces or understand what their calculations were at the time, but I don't think anybody would have expected that the international community would have been so complicit and so allowing of these horrors to take place day after day for 365 days now. It doesn't seem like it's going to end anytime soon. Again, my calculations, and this is just my own assessment, is we would have imagined that they would have taken the captives, and this would have forced a renegotiation between the two, between the settler and the resistance forces in order to lift the siege and end the blockade. Again, on day 2 of the operation, Hamas had announced to Israeli sources through official channels that they're willing to release all the hostages with no conditions, as long as they do not enter into Gaza and invade it. However, they rejected these negotiations, and this is a clear indication, as we've seen, that this is the whole operation that Israel's taking and its violent response was never really about returning its captives and its own people, because it's killed many of them. It refuses to negotiate for the release of them. It wants the eradication of Palestinian society in Gaza, and it's been doing so for the past year on end, nonstop. We've seen every single sacred institution and internationally protected institution under law being obliterated to smithereens: hospitals, schools, mosques, even churches, Bob. I mean, the third oldest church in the world actually exists in Gaza. And, this actually, Hamas has been controlling Gaza since 2005. And if they're a violent terrorist Islamist organization that is sectarian in its character, why did they never destroy any of the 3 standing Palestinian churches that existed there? It was actually Israel that bombarded the 3 Palestinian churches and destroyed them in its entirety. I thought before we were having this conversation, maybe I'd talk about the key massacres or the key killings that resulted, but there are just so many, Bob. Every single day, upwards of 100, 150 people are being slaughtered in every space imaginable, in the safe zones, in the refugee camps, in their own homes, walking down the street and the markets. So there is no key point in this of the massacres. It's just been slaughter after slaughter. This is a policy that they've undertaken because they control the skies over Palestine, and they can drop bombs, 2,000-pound bunker busters, on refugee camps in Al-Mawasi, which is designated as a humanitarian safe zone, with zero repercussion. They can drop chemical weapons. They can kill without impunity. And of course, we can discuss this later, that they've documented their own war crimes. Their own soldiers have documented it gleefully and shared it on social media sites. So there's just so many factors that have come about in this. It's one characterized by extreme suffering, extreme loss, extreme despair at levels none of us could have ever calculated. But Bob, I think looking back at a year, even though we're on the brink of a regional war, that the one that actually the West and Israel, spearheaded by Israel, is trying to push in the region. If you look back and try and see over this 1 year, okay, the settlers have bombed the crap out of Palestine. They have enacted the most vicious and violent forms of terror on a population that is unarmed and that has no form of self-defense. But what objectives have they really achieved? From day one, the state of Israel has announced its 3 main objectives: to control Hamas, to end Hamas, to control Gaza, and to return its settlers and restore their communities in the settlements surrounding Gaza. And a year today, we haven't seen any of those objectives being fulfilled by them. 1 year later, the resistance has taken hits and loss, but it has actually been kept strong throughout this whole year. They've been able to launch operations against the invading forces. The settlers that have been held captive are still underground. There are around 100 that still remain at least 33 of those are dead. So, and the numbers might actually be much higher than that. Israel still has failed in returning them home. And lastly, much of the settlements that existed around Gaza prior to October 7th still remain uninhabited. So this is a major loss for the settler colonial power in that regard. They have also lost the entire international standing. The world policy has shifted against the state of Israel. Of course, our regimes and our ruling classes have continued to support them diplomatically and politically. But even that tide is shifting, of course, and this we can discuss later. But then there's a further dimension to that too, is that Israel was not expecting that it would take such a major economic toll across the colonized territories of Palestine. And this is a discussion we'll continue with. And second is that they did not expect that they would face such strong resistance in the northern part of occupied Palestine by the Lebanese resistance forces under what's called the Jabhat al-Samud, the steadfast front. So when you look back at this, it had been major miscalculations for the settler forces. They have upwards of 110,000 that are still displaced across occupied Palestine. They have not achieved any of their objectives, and they are living on borrowed time, just begging for more and more weapons from the United States and its backers to conduct its genocidal project. So here we are a year later. There are, of course, many dark aspects of this that frankly might not even be able to recover from. But there are, as a historian with revolutionary optimism, I always try to look and see what has yet to be achieved and what can be done and where do we stand now. And if you look at the settler power with all of its imbalance in forces and all of its military might, it has been unable to achieve any of its targets and objectives and is taking massive hits on the economic, diplomatic, and militaristic fronts. So I hope that gives a sort of overview of where we stand today.
No, yeah, there's so much to this and there's so much connected to it. One quick thing though, maybe because the media since October 7th and the US government has almost, with a laser focus talked about Hamas. And so, everything began on October 7th, 2023, and everything is because of Hamas. Could you just kind of really briefly talk about, what kind of the role of Hamas, how it got started, the fact that it was elected, and the kind of communication and rapport it has with the community?
Yeah, absolutely, Bob. So Hamas emerged in the late 1980s in the turn of what became a new era of Palestinian resistance, of calculations within the Palestinian resistance forces. I mean, historically, post 1948, beginning with the late 1950s, early 1960s, the Palestinian resistance forces that made up the Palestinian revolutionary movement all belonged to radical secular and left-wing movements. They belonged to the chief one being Fatah, which was a secular anti-colonial national liberation movement. Of course, in the secondary and tertiary were Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine and its offshoot, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which were Marxist organizations with Leninist and Maoist tendencies, respectively. They had dominated the political scene of the resistance for the majority of the 60s and the 70s up until the 80s. Of course, today they still have a big role to play, but they've been overshadowed by the rise of Hamas. Hamas came about at a very difficult and time for not only the Palestinian left,
Just, I mean, and wasn't Hamas created with Israel's support?
um, it's a difficult discussion to have because it's not necessarily with their implicit support, but they were supportive of having an external force to combat the existing structures of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement because they saw them as ways similar to the ways that the Mujahideen, that the United States was funding different Islamist groups in Afghanistan and across the Muslim world, that's doing some similar sort, could exact some sort of counterbalance and destroy the Palestinian resistance from within. And mind you, I must make very clear, there are very large distinctions between Hamas and between the Mujahideen. It's an anachronistic comparison. I just wanted to make that out there. course, Hamas, when it emerged, it had been historically part of the Muslim Brotherhood Association. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood, historically across the Arab world, is one that rejects the use of armed resistance and armed violence against occupying powers and ruling forces. Its main modus operandi is actually to build social bases and to build a political front through community services, through social institutions, through welfare programs. But these calculations changed by the 1980s. They changed because Palestine had, let's take the Gaza Strip, for instance, it had been under direct Israeli occupation and rule ever since it was taken in the 1967 war. And settlers had returned, had come and colonized parts of the Gaza Strip. So there were major recalculations and reassessments, and ones that actually weren't taken lightly within the organization itself. The question of whether or not to take up armed struggle was one that wasn't taken lightly upon them. But it emerged, and also with the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, in the context of a vacuum, a large vacuum that was emerging, and as I said earlier, amongst the crisis of the left in Palestine, in the Arab world, and amongst the third world, and as we know it. I mean, with the dismantling of the Soviet Union in the 1980s, the abandonment of national liberation causes around the world, and the turn to a global neoliberal economic order, a lot of the funding structures, a lot of the support, a lot of the channels of which the Palestinian resistance historically had were withering away, and they no longer had the capacity they once did to sustain armed resistance or resistance in general against the colonial forces. And this stems with the turn of the balance of power in the force in the regions too. Of course, you know, the Marxist regimes that were supporting Palestinian liberation and other anti-colonial forces were on the decline, and their funding had left. So then there became a historic vacuum whereby other forces like Iran and Syria and Iraq and Libya began to support in ways. Of course, they had different various means of support, but the Palestinian resistance, Hamas, which Hamas is an acronym in Arabic for Al-Muqawama Al-Islamiyya, Harkat Al-Muqawama Al-Islamiyya, the movement of Islamic resistance, which is what Hamas is as an acronym. So it emerged basically during the time of the Second Intifada, and it already had large structures from within. Of course, they'd been operating clandestinely for many years. The biggest problem with the Palestinian resistance is while they did have large bases of support and strong presence across historic Palestine over the years, they were being targeted at a very horrific scale. They were being destroyed at every front possible. They were, of course, being driven further and further away from historic Palestine. They were driven to Jordan first, and then to Lebanon, and then after 1982, they were driven all the way out to Tunisia after the siege of Beirut in 1982. So the Islamic resistance forces filled in this vacuum, and they actually, the interesting part, Bob, is that they were able to bring in various forces amongst them. A lot of Palestinians who were part of Fatah, for instance, or part of the DFLP, historically Maoist organization, joined into the structures of Hamas because they were, of course, they then became the leading resistance movement over there in Palestine by the start of the First Intifada. Also, and of course, this happens simultaneously with the erosion of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement following the Oslo Accords and the transformation of Fatah and the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, into the Palestinian Authority, which became essentially a tool for maintaining the occupation. So the vacuums were made in various fronts, from the erosion of the left, from the destruction of the Palestine Liberation Movement, from the loss of Palestinian lands, from the acceleration of the consequences of the Oslo Accords. So when the traditional resistance movements no longer became the active force fighting the colonial powers, the Islamic resistance were able to take up action, and their prominence really shot up in the run-up to the Second Intifada and into the Second Intifada and during the Second Intifada themselves, when they started to present themselves on the political scene as the force that was confronting the enemy. Because, of course, the traditional forces had either been so maligned, like the parts of the left, or the main national liberation movement had been incorporated into a policing force for the occupation itself within Palestinian lands that were allocated under the Oslo Accord. So, and of course, I might add, Bob, that there are political disagreements, of course, and contradictions between the Islamic resistance and the left-wing secular Marxist national liberation forces that exist among Palestine. So they might be on the conservative stream on that regard, but on the anti-colonial question and on the question of armed struggle, they're actually very mainstream in Palestinian and Arab politics, and to a large extent to national liberation politics as a whole. So they were able to insert themselves not only in Gaza, but also in large parts of Palestine and of the West Bank in Palestine. So come the end of the Second Intifada, which ended with the assassination of Yasser Arafat, which ended in the building of the separation wall in the West Bank and the cutting off of Gaza in its entirety from the world. The US spearheaded under George Bush elections, which they wanted to show as a facade to show that they're allowing the people to decide what they wanted, of course, thinking that they were going to rig it in terms of favor of the Palestinian Authority. And by late 2005 to early 2006, they had actually come to a historic failure. For the first time, Hamas was voted in by the Palestinian popular will. And mind you, this isn't just Muslims who are voting for Hamas and Islamist people, Muslims who were voting, people of the Islamic political trends. This was people who wanted a continuation of armed struggle and who wanted a continuation of confrontation and a refusal to accept the conditions of which were laid out by the failures of the Oslo Accords and the catastrophe of the Second Intifada. So by the time they were elected, of course, the US and Britain would not have it such. So they armed through the Israeli state, the PA, to sort of overthrow and coup Hamas. And it was a very violent and bloody period in Palestinian history. It lasted for a short time, but there were major clashes and confrontation. But even then, they ultimately failed in doing so. So Israel's response to this was that if we're going to let Hamas rule, they want to block them off on the world and subject them to collective forms of punishment indefinitely. So that's the conditions of which Hamas emerged and came to be on the political scene.
And just kind of one more element to that background. I mean, the international community, the UN, international courts, things like that, have kind of, described this as an occupation for quite some time, right? And which under international law does in fact give the Palestinians the right to defense.
Absolutely. It gives any population that is under any form of occupation, invasion, apartheid, the right under international law to take up arms and defend themselves. But of course, this argument has been applied to many cases across the world, but it has not been applied in the international community to the Palestinians. The Palestinians are denied their very fundamental political right, and this is part of the culmination of decades of its erasure and denial of its own political rights. Of course, it's not just its human rights; it's its political rights, which hold more currency on the international scale. That they have a right in and of itself to defend themselves from any force that it may be. And in this case, it just so happens to be the settler state of Israel. So yes, absolutely. And the same exists in Lebanon as well. I mean, this is not a detraction, but this is the context of which Hezbollah emerged in the 1980s. They emerged in the same sort of vacuum of structures of the Lebanese national movement that had withered away in the same. Of course, it's a different form of social organization of which Hezbollah emerged, but they too emerged out of the context of Israeli occupation to South Lebanon. So under international law, they have a right to armed self-defense as well.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll have enough time to talk about it at the end. One kind of last piece to this part is, at the very beginning, we talked about the destruction among people in Gaza, which has been covered fairly well. Maybe 100 plus 186,000 dead, according to the Lancet. Schools destroyed, hospitals destroyed, lack of clean water. I mean, the kind of stuff, the destruction of a culture, the kind of stuff that actually fits the definition of a genocide, right? Genocide isn't just killing a lot of people. There's more to it. But what the media here hasn't done, and I've only picked it up kind of in bits and pieces by looking at social media, is Israelis' losses, right? So you get the sense, I mean, this is a slaughter, it's an atrocity, it's a war crime and all that. But the Palestinians are fighting back, right? And that's kind of, I think, one piece that we don't get. And perhaps, because you're looking at different media and you have, obviously language assets that I certainly don't. What impression do you have of what Israel is kind of suffering? Now, it's kind of hard to talk about their economic losses because the U.S. keeps writing them checks to kind of cover that. But in terms of just kind of the destruction, among Israeli forces, among Israeli military equipment, and then, even obviously, I think a little easier to talk about is their standing in the world, which has I think, taken some huge hits. But kind of what's Israel? What price has Israel paid? I hate to say that because it sounds glib, but you get my point, right? In the past year, Israel has probably taken some big hits as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are many very crucial points that are all interconnected to one another. They all fall back under the economic and the political costs of waging this destructive genocide on Gaza. And I didn't mention earlier, but I think it's very important to stress, Bob, that let's first talk about the Israeli losses on October 7th. The settlements themselves, Bob, I think they're portrayed, and there's this sort of imagination that the settlements are like Daisy and Rose farms where people bake bread and do yoga and have kumbaya moments.
Kibbutzes, yeah.
Actually, these kibbutzes, Bob, are the first line of oppression against the Palestinians. The Gaza division, the forces of which have been terrorizing Gaza from the start of its besiegement since 2005, are all under these settlements. These settlements themselves are military outposts, militarized outposts with soldiers, mind you. Every Israeli citizen over the age of 18 is conscripted into the force. So these settlements are military sites, they're military bases, military occupations zones. So when the media presents October 7 as this attack, the most vicious attack that the world has ever seen, the most barbaric form, well, you should actually look at it in terms of in international terms. International human rights law. These were a resistance force who attacked the main bases and outposts of which the occupying forces exist. Now, it is not the resistance problem or fault that the Israeli state endangers its own citizens by placing women, children, and elderly inside the military outposts they call settlements. So they are the ones who are actually using civilians as human shields in their settlements and in their military bases. So that's one point. The second point, Bob, is that after October 7, attacks have been against settlers and against so-called civilians in historic Palestine have been extremely minimal. They've been reduced to very limited numbers of rocket fires that have been sent out from Gaza across parts of Palestine, reaching as far as Tel Aviv, which is actually part of historic Jaffa. But the vast majority, and actually it's worth noting small individual acts of operations that here and there sporadically that have been taking place, but the overwhelming majority, in fact, the vast amount of Israeli losses have been their soldiers who are invading into Gaza. The resistance is targeting soldiers in their bulldozers, in their aircraft, in their armored tanks, in their armored personnel carriers, in their military bases that they've set up inside Gaza itself. And today, I think Israel put a figure that they've lost around 726 or 727. I'm not sure, but the figures are actually much higher. Of course, they count the number of active duty soldiers that were and that were killed on October 7th itself. But the numbers, Bob, we estimate to be much higher. Why? Because Israel only announces its losses after and its deaths after they've gone through military and security clearances. One, they don't announce mercenaries that have been killed in this too, both foreign and local mercenary forces. They don't announce all of the reservists that have been killed in this. They talk about the actual structures of the IDF, which we call, which anti-colonial language is the IOF, the Israeli Occupation Forces, and they don't announce the special forces that have been taken out in these as well. So on the one hand, you have within this imbalance of power that's taking place, you have a settler force that is bombarding from land, air, and sea against civilians indiscriminately, wherever they may be, however they may be, against a population that's resisting, only attacking the military structures that are invading and occupying them. The losses, they don't announce the infrastructure losses that they take up, for various reasons, for security reasons, for reasons that they don't want to erode this image of their invincibility. But we've seen from documentation and from news coverages and from reports and from accounts documented accounts that hundreds of tanks, armored personnel carriers, and bulldozers have been taken out by handmade RPGs and rocket launchers underground, Bob. So you can imagine that the United States is sending billions and billions of dollars to make bulldozers that are upwards of $1 million, armored personnel carriers that are $1 million plus, tanks that range from $3 to $8 million that are being destroyed by a homemade rocket that maybe costed less than $50 to $100 to make itself. So in terms of guerrilla operations and the forces we fight, that the losses have been way more catastrophic for them than they have been for the Palestinians, because these are people who are facing starvation, hunger, they're facing unprecedented levels of losses, who are still able to ambush the invading forces, who are still able to destroy their tanks and their weaponry. Throughout the year, we've seen videos and images of helicopters swooping in to take their casualties and out of Gaza and return them back into Israel for treatment or for burial or whatever. But the political cost is raising for them from within, not only the economic cost, because like you said, the United States and France, even France now, and this is the funny part, which we'll discuss later, but the United States, the EU, the United Kingdom, France, all of its historic backers can keep writing blank checks, but this money will dry up at some point. And there is no such thing as an infinite sum for this kind of war. The estimates are around 100 plus billion that have been spent on a tiny enclave, Bob, that has no elevation, that is a beachfront, that is besieged for 18 years, to cost that obscene amounts of money and to be unable to conduct any of its objectives are a historic failure for the Israeli military and the Israeli political establishment too. From the economic costs that did not come as part of their calculations and that they were not expecting at all was the support front. I'm sorry, I said earlier the steadfast front, but it's actually the support front that Yemen, that Lebanon, that to some extent Iran and the Islamic resistance in Iraq have waged in support of Palestine. And that, unlike the Israeli forces who only know how to extract damage on civilian structures, civilian populations, on places that are protected under international law, the resistance forces around are targeting military infrastructure, technology bases, weapons depot, sabotage operations around bases, around I mentioned telecommunications already. So and we see this exactly like when Iran launched their rockets onto Israel on October 1st in response to the killing of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah and Ismail Haniyeh. a lot of the Israeli commentators and Western supporters of Israel were mocking them that they didn't manage to kill a single person in these attacks. Well, I think this only speaks to the level of violence that they know that a successful operation for them is when you kill people and when you destroy their livelihoods. When in fact, actually, these rockets were targeting military bases, they were targeting intelligence headquarters, they were targeting the main air base of which the jet fighters are launched into Gaza. And there are reports, we're not sure how true of it is yet, because Israel is keeping it very, very tight kept secret, that perhaps up to half of their F-35 arsenal of jet fighters have been depleted from the Iranian attacks that were launched on October 1st. Now, this also too is what the resistance front and the support front in the north of Lebanon is doing to north of occupied Palestine. Of course, Haifa, which is in the north of Palestine, is the largest economic center historically of Palestine before its colonization too. And it actually just yesterday there were attacks launched on its main port, and these are major for the Israeli state because, of course, as we know, Yemen has for the past 11 months now, since November 19, launched its own blockade against the port of Eilat, which is in the historic Palestinian town of al-Rashash, which was also the secondary main port of Israel, through which key supplies were needed. So they have essentially managed to destroy and cut off, render ineffective the port of Eilat and al-Rashash. They've caused severe economic losses and disruptions within Haifa and the north. There are 100,000 plus settlers who are living under the state's dime, unable to go back to their settlements. There are infrastructure that has to keep being restocked and restocked, like the Iron Dome and the Iron Shield and all of these weapons and bombs that the U.S. has so far just given a blank check to. But it's enacted severe impediments on the project and its ability to sustain itself. And it cannot sustain itself in the long run, too. It's also very worth noting that prior to October 7th, around 50,000 Palestinians inside Gaza would cross daily through the Erez crossing into as farm labor for the state of Israel. So that went out immediately. So now they have a labor shortage. They also have a domestic labor shortage too, in that its own settlers are being sent in large numbers to go fight these wars that they're waging now in Lebanon, in Gaza, in extending the occupation in the West Bank. And mind you, I apologize. I said Erez crossing, but it's historically the depopulated Palestinian town of Dimra. I just forgot the name in the moment. But so on the economic front, while they may have an open check, we're starting to see major cracks, and we can see it here in the United States. That while the Democratic Party has unwavering support for the genocide that it's complicit in conducting and funding to the teeth, its base is actually flocking in droves against these policies. They have forever shifted, and this takes us to the political cost, they've forever shifted U.S. perceptions in youth and other segments of the population on the state of Israel, especially noteworthy too among the Jewish population in the United States. We're seeing the highest levels of anti-Zionist Jews emerging in history it's actually not in history since 1948. Of course, prior to 1948, the majority of the world's Jews were anti-Zionists, and the majority of those who were exterminated in the Holocaust were actually those who refused the Zionist project in itself. That's a key point to note. But this turning point is not one that's only happening in the United States. We're seeing mass historic levels of continuous protests and support and solidarity efforts that are taking place for Palestine. Palestine went from being on the back burner of regional and global politics to being the central political question that occupies every space in the international community. Every single country, from the United States to even historically very strong Zionist communities like Norway, which actually even went in and acknowledged the state of Palestine. It's now opened an embassy for Palestine and has diplomatic relations with it, along with 15 other countries, of which I think 12 of them are European countries itself. So we're seeing on the political front that there are major, massive tolls that are taking place on the Zionist project. Of course, the main important one too is that the mask has been taken off on Zionism for what it is. There's no more sugarcoating of what its project is. It's a settler extermination project that wants to eliminate Palestinians and wants to colonize. Well, has been colonizing the entire space, but long gone are these facades that it once maintained under the international community, and it cannot recover from it, whether it be Netanyahu or any other figure that follows next from it. And even within its own community itself, I mean, we've seen massive protests against the government from within. Of course, it has a different dimension and it's died out a lot. It focused especially on the return of hostages and the ceasefire because the economic and political and social toll was becoming very high for these settlers who, as our dear friend Nate George noted in a podcast episode with you, is that they're not used to being cut off from their electricity. They're not used to having no Wi-Fi, to fleeing their homes, to being under constant barrage and attacks for the settler project that they've set up in parts of in northern Palestine. So there, of course, this died down now with Israel's invasion of Lebanon, which is widely supported amongst the Israeli society. But as you can see, the economic and the political costs are starting to mount up. The money will dry. I am convinced of that. I know that regardless of who succeeds Joe Biden as the president of the United States, they will maintain unwavering support to the state of Israel. But we have to look as historians to the larger implications and the larger consequences of these. And Palestine might not be liberated within the next year or the next 2 years, but it's set the trails of motion that are irreversible for what will be the demise, in my opinion, of the state of Israel.
Yeah. Just a few more things because I know you have stuff to do, but kind of a key liberal talking point, as we talked about earlier, is Hamas, right? Like they kind of always try to turn around and Hamas did this and Hamas did that, and much of it is just made up. But I think one of the other talking points you often get is that Hamas doesn't represent the people of Gaza, or that Hamas is putting them in harm's way. Hamas was elected, right? What do you see as their standing right now within the community there? I mean, clearly, it's difficult living, right? But Hamas is the resistance, the face of resistance. What kind of support, what kind of credibility does it have?
Sure, sure. But of course, before I get into that point, I just want to briefly mention that one of the key points to debunk the myths that are waged against Hamas in the Western corporate media establishments and Zionist propaganda and Hasbara is that Hamas wants to eradicate all Jews and Hamas wants to exterminate Jews. This is actually a gross miscalculation and a gross lie that has no basis.
But they say from the river to the sea, right? That's
Actually,
all it takes.
they also say the exact same thing as well, but from their river is from the Nile to the Tigris, so it's actually a much larger from the river to the sea than what Palestinians are calling for, which is the return of their homeland and the end of a colonial project. But if one reads, and this is available in English, people must encourage anyone as a historian or anyone who wants to think outside of what the corporate media spews about and slanders about Hamas and other resistance movements, is that in their 2017 charter, which is available in English, they explicitly say that our problem does not lie with Jewish people or the Jewish faith. We are not anti-Jews. They are anti-Zionist. It just so happens to be that the colonizing force is a Jewish people. But regardless of what the religious composition or ethnic composition of the people who colonize them, they're going to take up arms and resist them. So that's one important thing. The second thing, Bob, is that, look, Hamas has never had hegemony over Palestinian politics. Hamas, for better or worse, or for all their ills, never had, there was always forms of discontent from within and from without, like any political force and any political party, right? But Hamas was never seen within the Palestinian inhabitants nor Palestinian community abroad as a totalitarian force, as a dictatorial force. They were a force who were elected and then besieged and then left to govern a part of historic Palestine that actually was the only free part of Palestine from edge to edge. I mean, it was, yes, besieged from the world, but it was the only continuous strip of Palestine that was liberated. The West Bank is Bantonized and cantonized, Bob. It exists in little pockets of Palestinian cities and towns surrounded by settlements and walls and military bases and no-go zones and in uninhabitable sites, which are only accelerating since October 7th. But the point is, Bob, that the Palestinian people are much smarter than what the international media sets them out to be. And the Palestinian population does not take their dictates from what media sources tell them. They take their analysis from what's happening on the ground. Yes, maybe there might be segments of the population who do not agree with Hamas. There might be some who did not maybe support, who might exact some degree of blame on their ills for what Hamas did. But the vast majority and the overwhelming majority of the population know that this was coming with or without October 7th. The ethnic cleansing of Palestine is one that stems since the Zionist project began in the late 19th century and when it took fruition in the early 20th century. We know that their main end game is to destroy Palestine. The tripartite of the Israeli ruling establishment with Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, and Smotrich in the past year leading up to October 7 have made clear that they present three choices amongst the Palestinian population. They either kill them all, they drive them all out, or they suppress them to end. And the Palestinians refuse these options. The Palestinian people are people who deserve dignity, life, and freedom, political rights as anybody in this world is deserving of. So they know beyond this facade that Hamas is not the reason for these massacres. It's the settler colonial force that wants to exterminate them. And the greatest indicator, Bob, to show that Hamas actually has the vast majority of support within Palestinian society, especially in Gaza too, is that Israel and the United States have repeatedly announced attempts to sort of create opposition movements and opposition groups from within. It's part of the American playbook for regime overthrow, where they take segments of the population who they can cooperate with to be forces that are loyal to them. They tried this with the PA inside Gaza. They tried it with tribal groups. They tried this with maybe merchants or people that have connections or ties in Israel. And these have fallen flat repeatedly. They have no currency, no standing, because people see it for what it is. They're being exterminated. And there's only one force inside that's actually protecting their rights and fighting for their dignity. So whether they see themselves as dying under the bomb that hit them now, or dying from 18 years of malnutrition, of blockade, of the highest rates of cancer in the world, from besiegement, from misery, from suffering, from the tolls of the wars that preceded it. They knew that this was happening with or without October 7. And of course, the state of Israel would have accelerated these projects with or without. It just gave them an excuse. So, and actually, the ironic part and the part that's been most destructive for Israel is that Hamas has actually shot up in the international community as the main resistance force representing the Palestinian people. I mean, the narrative that Hamas were a terrorist organization had strong saliency and currency amongst Western circles. But, while some people do still perpetuate that myth, the support has shot up dramatically. It has not only inside Gaza, inside the West Bank, within the Arab world itself, but also within solidarity movements So to answer your question, it's clear that regardless of what would have come from October 7th, the Palestinian people see beyond this. They know that the destruction is not brought by Hamas. And Hamas has made it clear from day one, we're willing to end all our acts. We're willing to disarm We're willing. Yahya Sinwar has even agreed to be put up on trial at the ICJ. He welcomed it, as long as Netanyahu was as well. So they, pardon me, the Palestinian people recognize that no matter what happens, they're always going to be subject to this sort of brutality under colonial rule, with Hamas or without Hamas. It was enacted on them in 1948, in 1967, in the years that continued. So, regardless of who is representing them, the viciousness and the violence will remain against them. And if anything, Bob, too, Hamas has been able to recruit and expand its resistance capabilities in the past year or so. I mean, if somebody were to say lost all their family, lost their home, been displaced a dozen times, have nothing or nowhere to go, their only option is to take up arms, and this is what's been happening. So no, I think I think categorically the Palestinian society has not abandoned the cause, has understood that Hamas are the line of defense against complete extermination. So yeah.
So this is kind of glib, but I think this way. I think of the Vietnam era and how, kind of the U.S. indiscriminate bombing just actually helped create support for the National Liberation Front. And you're kind of seeing this here. I have a ton more to talk about, but we're getting close. So let me just kind of a couple more things to finish up. One, which I think maybe kind of in some regard, in the long term, maybe one of the more important developments here is the international response to this. You mentioned Hamas's reputation has gone up. Israel's gone even worse, right? And we're seeing now, kind of surprisingly, like Emmanuel Macron has become kind of the moral compass, right? The voice of reason in all of this. But you mentioned earlier, other European countries have recognized the Palestinian state. You have Ireland has been particularly strong in this. Spain, inside the U.S., there is a significant resistance to this, especially from groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, which, if Kamala Harris loses, that'll be why, right? So we have this kind of, and now we have Israel kind of expanding into, creating a larger war. I wouldn't even say it's on the verge of a larger war. I think it's already a regional war, right? And we're going to have you back on for kind of a regular show to talk about Yemen and the Houthi and the kind of role of trade and shipping and commerce in the region. But kind of long-winded point here. But how do you perceive this a year in, kind of the way that Israel has kind of lost a lot of standing in the world, how it's become isolated, although it's still going to obviously get blank checks from whoever the president is, right, of the United States, whether it's Trump or Harris, they're going to get the same level of support. The weird thing about this is if Trump wins, you're going to see significant resistance in the streets because so many of the people now who are upset about this won't do it, right? But with Trump, they will. But kind of getting to the point here. So you see wars now in Lebanon, in Iran, right? How do you perceive that? I mean, do you think that in the long run helps the Palestinian cause? The fact that there's, even though right now it's a very, frightening situation, right? Especially for the people of Lebanon and people of Iran, right? But how do you perceive this kind of? I would think that in many ways it's the most important development, maybe the biggest accomplishment, is to kind of expose this to the entire world now. So it's really, really hard unless you're like the New York Times or some American paper, the Washington Post or whatever, New York or Atlantic. I could go on and on, but you get my point. The liberal media in the U.S. Other than that, I mean, it's been exposed, hasn't it? The reality there now. It's kind of hard to say you didn't know, right?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It's been exposed on many fronts, and this is going to turn out to be a huge miscalculation from its part. Might I say, Bob, I wish to note for the viewer that Lebanese people have endured after the Palestinians the most violence and the most level of onslaught from the state of Israel since 1948, from the wars that's enacted on
I
it.
think last week was the anniversary of Sabra and Shatila, right?
Last week was September 17th was the anniversary.
I'm sorry, okay, but it was recent, yeah.
It was
Which,
recent.
again, the media likes to begin this on October 7th, a year ago today, whereas the reality is obviously very different.
Yeah. And Shatila has actually been subjected to intense bombing today, and not today, the past week. I mean, we've seen horrific videos that are reminiscent of 1980, 1982, of Palestinians fleeing from the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila, the way that they were in 1982. But, on the other front, Bob, while the United States and its chicken hawks are the ones that are most feverish to go to war with Iran and create a wider war. It's actually been it's faced huge opposition of the international community. Let's take, for instance, the regional forces. Of course, there've been this sort of political aggressions and power struggles that have been taking place between the Gulf monarchies and Iran ever since the mid 2000s onwards, that really hyped up in the post 2015 era onwards. In the past year, China has been able to broker negotiations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The day that Iran launched its attacks onto Israel, the Saudi foreign minister hosted the Iranian president, where he explicitly told him that they reject the war and they want to bury all of their differences for good, that they want cooperation and they want peaceful relations amongst each other. Immediately after this as well, Qatar's foreign ministry managed to bring in all of the foreign ministers of the Gulf Cooperation Council to put out a joint statement saying that they refuse this aggression into a wider war and they'll not allow their airspace to be used for conducting operations on Iran, which, by the way, every single one of them has a U.S. military base station in them, the largest in the world being in Qatar. So I don't think this is the way that the state of Israel expected it to be. I think they were expecting the chicken hawks in the United States who are itching to go to war at any opportunity possible with Iran, being faced with immense pressure across the world. The United States cannot afford to go to war with Iran, despite it having bases and nuclear weapons pointed at it everywhere, from Pakistan all the way through the arc to Turkey and into Iraq and the Gulf countries. It's the political and the economic costs are way too high from it as it's moving into full-scale war into Lebanon, which, by the way, it's using the same tactics that it's doing into Gaza. It's attacking healthcare infrastructure. It's destroying the main roads in Lebanon, the road to its only highway, and the road to the main border crossing between Syria and Lebanon. It's bombing schools. It's bombing healthcare workers. It's dropping insane amount of bombs under the Dahiya doctrine. Dahiya, of course, is the suburb, the resistance stronghold in south of Beirut, where the policy is to exact as much destruction and damage on a civilian-centered population in order to create the pressure and the conditions to win a war. So this is the context of which 81 bombs, by the IOF's admission, were dropped on Dahi when Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah was assassinated. So and like you said, it's gotten to the point. We always say, do you know how bad you have to mess up for Emmanuel Macron to be on the right side of history? For Emmanuel Macron, who's been begging to play a bit part role and to be a junior partner with Israel since October 7, is now calling for an arms sales and an arms embargo on Israel. So the calculations have backfired horrifically. The damage and destruction they're bringing into Lebanon, it doesn't seem like it's going to end anytime soon. They are enacting vicious acts of violence across the region. They're even bombing Yemen. They've been bombing Syria intermittently for the past year. The havoc that they've wreaked is a full-scale war. We are there now. There's no doubt about it, especially with the invasion of Lebanon. But mind you, Bob, every single resistance force, from Hamas to Hezbollah, to the Ansar Allah in Yemen, to the Islamic resistance in Iraq, have all maintained one position, and one that Iran has also said that they support to, is that our attacks stop the day that the genocide in Gaza ends. Hassan Nasrallah said that on day one when they announced the support front and when they're opening the support front, that we will continue these operations until a ceasefire is reached in Gaza. Ansar Allah have announced that they will lift all the blockades on all the ships and they won't attack any infrastructure related to Israel the day that the genocide ends in Gaza. And the same with Iran as well. So it's clear here that there's only one entity that wishes to perpetuate endless wars in the region, and it's the state of Israel. And there's one main backer of this on the international plane, and it's the United States, because its forever wars need to continue in the region, no matter what cost it seems.
Yeah. We haven't even really talked about the U.S. role there, although I think most people are somewhat familiar with it. We've this is great. I mean, there's a million more things, and we'll have to do this again, and kind of talk about different stuff. But as I said, before, you have access to a lot of stuff that we don't. You know people in the region. You have language assets that I certainly don't. The last thing here, what sense do you get about how the people in Gaza or in Lebanon are feeling in the long run? Obviously, there's a great deal of fear, and that's the whole point of terrorism, right? To make people afraid. But do you think also there's some sense of hope from the resistance?
Of course, we'd want to be optimistic, Bob. It's very difficult to speak of hope when the levels of destruction we've seen have been enacted are. But of course, the second we lose hope is the second that we lose the cause in and of itself. And in no way am I suggesting that my people in Gaza are seemingly are a price to pay for the liberation of Palestine. But unfortunately, and as we've seen in several liberation struggles across the world, is that once a colonial or an imperial force realizes that it no longer has the hegemony and the control over the population it dominates, it goes into psychotic modes of terror against these people. We've seen that across the continent of Africa, we've seen it across the continent of Asia, and now we're seeing it in the context of Palestine too. Unfortunately, the deaths are going to keep continuing, and what day one looks like after a ceasefire is reached is miserable in and of itself. I mean, a report a month or two ago from the United Nations stated that it would take 15 years to clear out the rubble alone in Gaza. So, of course, one must keep a sense of cautious optimism while understanding that the genocidal project is as rampant as ever. But in the long run, there is, like as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, the perceptions of Zionism have forever altered. The international standing of the State of Israel has withered irreversibly. The Palestinian question is now at the center stage of global political affairs, and this isn't going to go away anytime soon. Of course, I hope that the situation in Lebanon and the colonial war that Israel's waging is brought to an end in the immediate possibility, as we hope, of course, for in Gaza, but it doesn't seem like it's going away anytime soon. But at the same time, the resistance have made clear that they're not going away either. The state of Israel is taking major hits in South Lebanon. I mean, if they've taken such catastrophic losses in Gaza over 1 year in a besieged front, imagine the kind of force and the kind of resistance they'll face on a mountainous terrain like the south of Lebanon that has been preparing for years for confrontation with Israel, that actually liberated its country from Israel in 2000, which is the only country in the Arab world to liberate a land from Palestine, from the state of Israel, and that forced them into a humiliating ceasefire in 2006 as well. So they're not facing. So the state of Israel to the resistance is a paper tiger. They know that it will fold at some point, and it's going to come at a severe human loss, not to mention the economic one, which is nothing in comparison to the lives that we'll never regain from this. But there is hope that their liberation will be on the horizon. I mean, as Ilan Pappé, the esteemed historian, says that this is the beginning of the end for Zionism. Those who truly believe in the liberation of Palestine must hold that sincere and do everything in their means to make that a reality.
Well, it's been a year today that this genocide began, and we've witnessed, in real time, because of social media, kind of the most horrific things. We've seen the images and we hear the reports every day, and yet it continues. So, I think it's important to kind of keep this going because it could be easy with all the other stuff going on in the world, right? To kind of draw back and not talk about it as much. I mean, there's, superstorms and climate change and, unemployment and the crazy presidential election, all this other stuff. And that clearly, I think the political class in the U.S. is relying on that we quit talking about this. So I really appreciate it. Is there any kind of last thought or anything like that you want to add? Or
I guess the last thought to the audience and to listeners of this podcast will be to keep to keep the struggle and support going, to make sure to bring at the forefront the boycotts and sanctions against the state of Israel, and to demonstrate and to continue their opposition against the destruction of Palestine and now Lebanon, against escalation into a full-scale war. I guess as we get closer to an election, like you said, regardless of who takes the hot seat in as United States president, we're going to see similar forms of destruction in Palestine. But one can only hope that if one force is elected, that at least there will be mass opposition to it in the streets that can be connected to Palestine. And hope that just keep Palestine in your thoughts and keep Palestine in all of your actions, because these are people who are not only fighting for their freedom, but they're fighting for freedom for all peoples around the world. Because as many have commented around the world, like President Gustavo Petro of Colombia, what's happening in Palestine can happen to us anywhere in the world if we allow it to. So I think that would be the message.
Thanks so much. We'll have to have you on in a kind of an official podcast to talk about this in Yemen in particular some more, but I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
This is Fadi Kafeety, who is a Ph.D. candidate about to finish his dissertation at the University of Houston. I've known him well and have learned so much from you, so I really appreciate that. And thanks for talking with me. And we'll have to get together and do this again. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you so much, Bob.